Hello. Hi. We're just getting mic'd up at the moment, so I'm going to get started so we have some time. So first of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you for sticking around and joining us for the near end of GLF. The theme of this year's GLF is moving from commitment to action, and our panel includes a diverse mix of people from different parts of sort of the ecosystem that we need to have engaged. So I'm just going to start introducing people, and they will appear as they get mic'd. So first we have Christian Kroll, who's the founder and CEO of Ecosia, which is a search engine that uses its profits to plant trees and combat deforestation. We also have Juan Carlos Mendoza, who is a managing director for the global mechanism for the UN Convention to combat desertification. We have Celia Witehira, who is a representative of the Teikopu people of New Zealand and is part of a group that supports indigenous communities in the Pacific. And we have Nigel Sizer, who is the Chief Program Officer at Rainforest Alliance. So we're going to keep this conversational so everyone will have plenty of chances to speak. Just a reminder that we have Slido set up, so if you want to post questions or respond to questions, you can do it on that platform. So I'm going to start with you, Christian. So you basically went out and built your own thing. So you wanted to help protect forests, and you created this platform, which you're raising money now, and it's going to people who are actually on the ground taking action. So can you explain your role in kind of driving action in this space?
Yes, I'm wondering, my role was really just to make something happen, which is something that I deeply care about. So what I saw pretty much was a problem. So before I started Ecosia as a search engine, I traveled for about 1 year around the world, and I saw a lot of injustice, I would say, and also environmental destruction, and I just thought, okay, I need to do something about that. I, of course, didn't know how to do it, but I think that's a quality that we probably need at the moment when we're talking to kind of going to action. Maybe we don't know all the answers yet, but I think we should get started. So that's what we're trying to do. With a lot of things, we don't know the answers, but still we somehow managed to plant 43 million trees by now, which is quite awesome. And when I say plant, then I mean actually trees in the ground and not commitments. So that is, I think, when we're talking about getting to action, then that's what I would like to see happening more.
Thanks, Christian. So Juan Carlos, you kind of sit, in a sense, between kind of commitments and action on the ground. So can you explain where UNCCD kind of fits in this whole ecosystem?
Sure. I think some colleagues before talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals are not just aspirational statements, but it can actually provide a roadmap for action. And this is what we're doing in the context of land, fighting land degradation and engaging in land rehabilitation. The UNCCD is actually working now with 120 countries that are establishing targets to achieve land degradation neutrality by 2030. And what this means is countries doing both the technical and political work that is required to identify areas in their landscape where there's substantial degradation, the type of actions that they want to take. And what we help countries is do that plan and then go to their development partners, to funders, and turn these SDG targets into real projects on the ground.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. So Celia, indigenous people are potentially the critical implementers of action actually on the ground. So can you explain a little bit your work and your goals?
In the communities that I work with in New Zealand, our Indigenous people in New Zealand are ready, and they immobilising themselves to use their traditional practices and their traditional knowledge to implement projects on the ground. And so really it's about creating pathways and empowering them through partnerships and through collaboration to be able to do that, and creating space for them to share their views and their aspirations on how they want their communities to be developed and how they want to be to see their environment restored, and then creating avenues for that to happen.
Thanks. So Nigel, Rainforest Alliance kind of works at all different scales. So I mean, you go all the way from the small community enterprises all the way to the largest corporations in the world. So how do you see yourself going? How do you see where your role in kind of going from commitments to action on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Red. Well, our best-known work is, of course, our certification program. So we manage a major certification program working with agricultural products, with millions of farmers, thousands of forest communities around the world, so connecting them with the thousands of companies that want to buy and sell sustainable products. We're actually launching a new draft standard on Monday, so it's a very exciting time for our certification program. Beyond that, we are working to build and support bright spots of landscape scale change around the world as well. I think some of our most exciting work has been in Guatemala and Mexico, in the Mayan Biosphere Reserve, and with the ejido communities across Mexico, also with cocoa farmers in West Africa, tea farmers in East Africa, palm oil communities in Indonesia, and so on. And we are working also on building new global alliances to tackle some of the emerging issues. So we have a major effort with something called the Accountability Framework Initiative, the Landscape Standard, and also a cross-cutting effort on capacity building for local groups to build their ability to advocate for change. It's called the Sector Partnerships Program with the Dutch government.
So there are all these great initiatives and all these wonderful ideas, but it seems like there's still a gap in terms of actually getting things done. So I wanted to ask everyone on the panel about what they see as being major barriers or bottlenecks to moving forward. So, Christian, I'll start with you. I mean, you kind of went out and just did something. What were the bottlenecks or the challenges you had, and actually once you had this revenue coming in to then getting trees planted?
Yeah, I mean, for us, for a while, it was a problem to actually find good tree planting projects. I heard that in a few other discussions as well, that people are looking for tree planting projects. By now, I think we found quite a lot of them, good ones. So if you're still looking, come to us. We can give you some good contacts. Bottlenecks that we see is that the amount of destruction is just so much bigger than what's actually being built up. And somehow, I think there needs to be global change of mindset. That is maybe the most important thing that needs to happen. So people, I think everyone, and also just consumers, of course, need to understand that they need to act differently if they want to see the world surviving the 21st century. So, I mean, for us, it's small steps. For example, I mean, one of our main challenges is, of course, that not enough people are using our search engine, because if more people would use our search engine, we would be able to plant more trees. So that's an important bottleneck for us. But I think that's kind of related to this bigger question: how important do we think climate change really is, and are we willing to actually do something now to really solve it?
Juan Carlos, what about you?
Sure. I think on this I want to bring a message of optimism, because the bottleneck that we have, fortunately, is not one of demand. And by demand, I mean consumers every day when they go to the supermarket, they want to buy products that they know are responsible and sustainably produced. Big donors, the traditional donors, and by this I mean governments, want to find projects that they can support. And even increasingly, the private sector in areas, for example, such as institutional investors, the large pension funds, want also to invest on landscape projects that they think is part of their mandate, not only from a financial point of view, but it's also a mandate that they are getting from their own retirees and whoever are contributing to those funds. So the positive message is the bottleneck is not on the demand side. The bottleneck is on the supply side, and that is countries, communities, rural cooperative farmers are not able yet, in many cases, to get the support to put together projects that they can present. And I think this is something that we in the convention are trying to address by precisely helping countries, particularly least developed countries that may be at a disadvantage in the competition for funding, to do that initial step of going from big policy statements down to specific targets, for example, related to the SDG, related to land, to having project proposals that they can present both to the public and to the private sector for funding. So in a sense, it's better to have as a bottleneck a problem of supply than a problem of demand. So it's not a bad bottleneck to have, let me put it that way.
It's interesting because Christian identified a demand gap and you just identified a supply gap. So curious as to what issues you're seeing as your major barriers in terms of in the Indigenous peoples communities.
As an Indigenous Māori woman from New Zealand, I do not separate myself from my natural world. I am a part of it. So some of the bottlenecks are around the differences in worldview and lack of understanding and fear about how they can work together. And that makes it hard for us to try and progress forward in this space. Also having to science thinking that they need to validate our traditional knowledge when our traditional knowledge is validated. It's been validated through generations of observation. And so it doesn't need to be validated because it is. And also working with the Indigenous communities in my home country, trying to fit into funding boxes where the projects that our people on the ground want to do don't fit in those boxes, because it's about sustaining traditional practices and looking at ways of restoration from a traditional or a cultural perspective, and these don't necessarily fit into the perfect little boxes of funding organisations, and then they're having to change their projects and what they want to do to fit into those boxes, and then they're having to apply for multiple different funding streams to try and do everything that they want. And this, and they're working, they don't have the administrative power and capability to do this because they're out there doing this with minimal funding, and so those create a lot of issues for them on the ground. And these are what we're dealing with. They want to do it, and they want to be empowered, but it's, having people to be able to trust that they're going to do it and empower them to do so.
It's interesting because what you're identifying seems to fit with what Juan Carlos is looking at. So it seems like there's an opportunity there to get together in terms of they're looking for projects and you're looking to have your projects fit into these frameworks better. So just an observation. So what about you, Nigel? What do you see as being the major barriers to progress on this front?
Well, we could catalog long lists of barriers and problems. I prefer to look at it from the other side. What's working? What are the bright spots? What are we learning? And the Global Landscapes Forum is a fantastic venue for sharing that information. There's tremendous documentation of that now available from some of the research partners here, like C4 and Eco-Agriculture Partners, that very clearly documents what's being learned from literally hundreds of different landscapes around the world that are making real progress. And what I'm seeing here at the conference really resonates, I think, with our direct experience on the ground. Basically what we see, so the key ingredients to success: good governance at the local scale, full recognition of local communities and Indigenous peoples' rights, for example, within that, and respect and participation by local people in these processes. The unglamorous process of building capacity, step by step, year by year, of local institutions to support and do the work on the ground. the tools that are needed to support that, finance, and that's where some of the market linkages and so on that we work with come in and are very helpful. Leadership and capacity to lead locally, training of leaders, and an enabling environment, supportive policy environment, norms and support from government fundamentally for work that's moving in this direction. And I think, and finally, a really key one, which we don't talk about perhaps so explicitly, is time. Our most effective work on the ground is where we have been able to be engaged already for over a generation, for 15, 20, 25 years of sustained work with sustained support and partnership and capacity building. That's where we see the greatest success.
Could we put up the Slido question real quick, just so the audience can see it? Thanks. So you see the question up there. We'll check back in a few minutes on that. So I mean, this all sounds great, but accountability is really important. And so, would be interested in getting the panel's thoughts on that. And, accountability means many different things to many people. But I mean, Christian, so for you, it's, I find your model very interesting because you're extremely transparent for a corporation, but you also have accountability sort of, are these entities actually planting the trees that you're paying for? So if you could talk a little bit about how you see, how you help foster accountability and what that means for making progress with action on the ground.
Yeah, I think so. What we're trying to do is lead by example first. So what we're doing, for example, we publish all our financial reports so that everybody can see how we spend our money, which I think is not very common. What we then, of course, also demand from our tree planting partners is that they deliver what they promise, and if they don't, well, then we start a conversation, and if they keep not delivering, then we have to remove them from our portfolio, which is, yeah, we just make sure that everybody keeps their promises. We also try to do that on a slightly bigger, more, let's say, scale of society, where we try to hold other organizations accountable. So we recently, for example, tried to buy the forest of Hambach. Who of you is aware of that? Do you know about that forest? Raise your hands. Yes. You. Thank you. So not sure if, for those who don't know about it, this is a forest that is an ancient forest that is located just 40 kilometers away from here, 12,000 years old. It contains a lot of endangered species. And right next to it, there's a big coal mine, which is owned by the largest energy operator in Germany, RWE. And they want to extend their production and cut down that forest, which is a very bad idea. And also most people in Germany think that it's a bad idea. So there were a lot of protests. So, well, we, of course, joined the protest, but we also thought, how can we actually help to make sure that this forest stays standing? And then we just had this idea of, well, apparently RWE in times of climate change is not a good owner of this forest anymore. How about we just try to buy it away from them? So that's one of the things that we tried to do. They didn't sell it to us, of course, but still, we realized that we as an organization, even though we're not, we're not activists, we're not Greenpeace, but still we realized that we as a tech startup, we can hold others accountable, and I think we should hold others accountable. And we simply don't have enough time to just be patient and, I don't know, just keep our mouths shut. So we realized that we actually can become activists, and maybe should too.
Thanks. So accountability, Juan Carlos?
Yeah, I think in our case, there is accountability arises from transparency. In the case of the Desertification Convention, there's formal transparency to a degree that when I mentioned earlier that countries are setting their targets on the Sustainable Development Goals related to land, they will report of how they move towards those by 2030. And we also, as part of this process, formally report periodically what are the financial flows going from both from donor countries as well as from some elements of the private sector into supporting measures to fight land degradation. But in addition to that formal process of transparency, there's what I would describe as the transparency that is given to consumers through many mechanisms. I mean, I think my colleague from the Rainforest Alliance will talk a little bit more about that, but I think the UN is also trying to play a role in this area by fostering the development of standards so that people can understand much better what is it that they are consuming on a day-to-day basis and what is the impact of that in terms of CO2, in terms of land degradation, in terms of indigenous people's rights. And I think this is going to be a key challenge of the next few years to change behavior at the consumer level.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. Celia?
I'm going to look at accountability slightly different. So there is accountability when it comes to finances and making sure that the money, when it's given for operations on the ground, actually gets there. Because some of the time I don't think it does. And but where I do want to look at it differently is accountability of governments that and acknowledging that lands were stolen and that people were displaced, accountability there and taking ownership for that, holding industry accountable for the degradation that they've done, where Indigenous communities are now left to be the ones having to find solutions and work with others on providing those solutions. In my country, it's also my government for allowing our lands to be sold offshore. So those sorts of things are, and I can go on with accountability outside of financials related to that sort of stuff. There's all sorts of examples of where people need to be held accountable for their actions in governments, internationally, for what's happened to Indigenous people on the ground.
Thanks. So, Nigel, I'd love to hear your thought, but also taking a step back, and you had obviously you were the previous institution that had a big role in fostering greater transparency. So, if you could also touch on that, that would also be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I think there's a huge accountability deficit across most or all of the actors, right? Governments willy-nilly make commitments that they often don't intend or don't significantly make the kind of effort they need to implement. Donors make commitments to major new funding and so on that they don't come through on often. Consumers, I think all of us probably are insufficiently accountable for our patterns of consumption. We all know, I suspect nearly everyone in this room knows that they are a little bit hypocritical when it comes to what they eat, how they travel, their lifestyles, and so on. And we all need to work on that. The piece of this that the Rainforest Alliance is working on is an alliance, a partnership that we've convened with a range of civil society leaders, including Greenpeace, WWF, Rights and Resources International, Forest Peoples Program, the Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, a whole bunch of groups globally, focusing on the commitments that the private sector has made to ethical supply chains, particularly around deforestation-free supply chains, and ethical in terms of workers' rights and land rights. And we've worked very hard to come to a consensus, which is now available online as a draft, that's in broad global review, a consensus about really what an accountability framework for those types of commitments should look like, what's an appropriate set of definitions for things like forests and deforestation, and developing a whole suite of guidelines and supportive materials for companies that are struggling to implement those commitments but are serious about it, and a framework that helps to hold companies accountable that have made commitments but are not following through, and then of course the ones that haven't even made the commitments on this. And yeah, for me personally, this builds on a long history of work in this area, particularly with World Resources Institute as well, with Global Forest Watch, which aimed at addressing the transparency piece of the accountability story around forests and land use change, and I think was a game changer in giving access to everyone, everywhere, real-time information about what's happening to forests on the ground, whether or not we had the permission of governments or companies or whoever to publish that information, and using that to drive change.
Thanks, Nigel. So I mean, one of the critical things is how do we go to scale on this thing, but also being cognizant of balancing the short term versus the long term. So the immediate needs versus building a sustainable system for the future. So I'm curious what the panel thinks about what we need to do now in order to really move this forward, but also considering the balance of what's urgent short-term priorities versus what we need to do for building really long-term change. So I'll go back to Christian for this one to start.
Yeah, I think what we need to do now is, it's taking action. So for me, I'm wondering, we're talking a lot about pledges and things that are supposed to happen, but in all the countries, or in most of the countries that we're working in, we never run into people actually planting trees, So apparently there's not enough action happening. If I see all these commitments that are being made, why isn't it happening now? We just can't be patient. We can't lose another 10 years. So for me, of course, we have to think long term. We have to do it in a good way, but we also have to start very, very soon. And that for me is what I think will be necessary to scale up, because we will, of course, make mistakes when we start, but we would also make these mistakes if we start in 10 years. So yeah, I would wish more people actually going out and starting planting trees, or doing regenerative agriculture, whatever it is, but actually doing stuff. For me, that is what is needed at the moment. And yeah, I'll try to do my best in my organization that we can kind of further scale up what we're doing, but I think other organizations also need to move faster, because we can't just have a global landscapes forum in 10 years and still have a forest loss. That's just not possible. Then we won't make the necessary changes that we need to survive the 21st century.
So just a quick follow-up. So I'm curious, if your queries increased by tenfold tomorrow, and you had this tenfold increase in revenue, would you be able to put that to work quickly, or would you really have trouble finding projects?
I think, we would maybe need some time to scale up, but I think by a factor of 10 we wouldn't run into real problems yet. We would need a few months to adapt, but it would be fine. We're also helping a lot of the organizations that we're working with to actually think about this scaling up, and also thinking about building business cases into their reforestation efforts. So I think more money would be better, which means more trees more users would also be better.
So Juan, Carlos, your thoughts on urgency versus long term?
No, I think the sense of urgency is very high, and I think what I would like, and this is a challenge for all of us, is we need to move out of our zone of comfort when we talk about landscape approaches or FLR. We need to be out there talking to others and linking it to other global problems that are not so obvious. Obviously, we know the linkage between this and climate change. We also probably need to make a stronger linkage with the community that is interested on enhancing biodiversity. But we also need to think about the linkages to other issues, such as, for example, the refugee crisis that we see every night in the news. We actually look at the linkages between the areas from where those peoples are coming and the areas where land degradation is the highest. So I think in order to impress into policymakers and to the general public who may not always be thinking like ourselves in terms of landscape approaches, we need to make the broader linkage to the problems of today that forests and land degradation in general could play in how we address them. So I think that would be my invitation, because otherwise we need to be conscious that we are competing not just for resources, but also for the willingness of individuals to take action, and to the degree that they see the broad ramifications that landscape approaches and FLR has, the more support will be for these activities.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. Cecilia?
So in terms of urgency, for us Indigenous people will be making sure that we have secure rights to land, water, resources and sustainable livelihoods. That would be the best approach to restoration and landscape management moving forward. For us in the South Pacific, we're oceanic people, so climate change is having a massive direct effect on us. Our Indigenous coastal communities in New Zealand and Micronesia are going to have to look at ways of whether it's moving or what it is, because their lands and their homes are being threatened by climate change due to the sea level rises, and these are real issues for us, and they're urgent. They are urgent for us. Also, the healing our communities, our Indigenous communities, providing safe spaces for them to heal, so that when we start talking about sustainable landscapes, they've gone through the process of grieving for what they've lost, for the removals and all that pain that they've gone through, generational pain, so that they can move forward and be ready to work in these spaces and to work with everyone. And also, women's rights. These are things that are urgent, and they're urgent for everyone.
Nigel, thoughts?
Well, since we're about to kick off the climate change conference of the parties, I think I would link that back to some of what we've been talking about here at the forum. So many thousands, millions of the farmers and forest communities that we are working with have planted trees, are protecting forests, are regreening their landscapes, and it's extremely hard for any of them to gain any financial benefit from the carbon sequestration service that they are performing. So they're doing this as part of certification systems and other efforts and so on. There are some benefits through some premium pricing for some of the commodities. For others, there's not even a premium price. Some of them have worked for years to verify and certify the carbon sequestration that's occurring, and they're unable to translate that into cash for various reasons. That needs to be addressed urgently, and I think it's a crying shame that that's still the case after so many years of work on this. And for me, what the forum is all about, and something that we all urgently need to be working very hard on always, is more collaboration and more alliance building. So a very outward-looking effort, very open-minded, work with each other to see how we can better work together to address these fundamental changes. That's why we're here at the Global Landscapes Forum, and so that's the other very near-term sort of basic part of this for us.
So Juan Carlos, Nigel just talked about this issue where these indigenous communities have worked really hard on these carbon projects and been unable to secure resource or funds for all this work. But you mentioned a dearth of projects, and I realize that you're working in a different sort of part of the system. But what's the disconnect? What's the gap there? Like, why? How can we make it work?
No, I think the issue of how to monetize. I guess the technical term is ecosystem services, but I think sort of global benefits that arise from private activities or private costs, let me put it in those terms. I think this is something that at the UN level and from the SDGs, again, I bring the Sustainable Development Goals point of view, we're also trying to find a way to monetize some of this. As you may remember, one of the SDGs has to do ultimately with sustainable consumption. And the only way to achieve sustainable consumption is precisely by making sure that the people who are incurring costs to generate these sustainable products can be compensated financially, ultimately, in some way. Now, having said that, that is also meant to be also the beauty of a landscape approach, where you're combining activities that lead to global benefits, such as carbon sequestration, with meaningful livelihoods to the communities that are doing it. Because I think sometimes we forget that for some people, achieving carbon sequestration or achieving a forest that is providing ecosystem services to the global community, that's not enough. that there are people living in those communities, and they also care, they are caring about better livelihoods for them and for their children. So we need to keep that always in mind whenever we take these approaches. And in the case of our convention, where obviously we are ultimately there to serve our countries, this is very key on how we integrate these activities into the economic development plans, particularly of the least developed countries where many of these interventions are taking place.
So Christian and Nigel, both of you are sort of, Christian, you're private sector. Nigel, you're not private sector. Well, that depends how you define it, but you're basically both taking kind of almost market-based approaches to this issue. And so I'm curious as to your perspective on this, because Christian, you just kind of went out and said, I want to do this, and you just kind of funded it. And so theoretically, you could be funding indigenous communities, for their carbon sequestration. So Christian and Nigel, how do you feel about, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I think, when we're talking about livelihoods and development, we're talking about getting money into the pockets. Part of it is just getting more money into the pockets of very poor people. So cocoa and coffee farmers and tea farmers and so on are working incredibly hard to meet expectations of the markets. Then you layer on expectations and demands around sustainability, which they work even harder to address. They get some modest premium for the product. At the same time, they're sequestering carbon, providing water services, protecting biodiversity, and getting little or no recognition or reward for that. It should be rewarded. Climate change is the greatest challenge facing humanity. And we're working with communities who are literally sequestering millions of tons of carbon, generating credits that they're unable to sell because governments and international processes do not support them, do not recognize their rights, won't work with them on the benefit sharing arrangements and so on, refuse to agree, refuse to move it forward, and it's years and years and years and years. And this is fundamentally unacceptable. And it comes back to the accountability. Where's the accountability around the commitments that all these institutions, all of our organizations are making to address this problem?
Yeah, I see it kind of similar. So my observation is that many of these commitments will maybe never come true, or at least I don't have the patience to wait for them. So what our approach is in our tree planting projects, we're actually now working together with them so that they can make the tree planting profitable. This way they're independent from some kind of other higher level players that might not keep their commitments. And for me, it's a shame, but to me it seems like this is the easiest approach at the moment out of everything that I'm seeing.
And that's very much what we're doing as well. But there could be so much more happening, right? What amazes me is how much the farmers and communities already do and how much you can already do. Mm-hmm. But if we really followed through on the commitments that the governments and companies and others have made, it would multiply the resources, the efforts, and the reward for what they're doing, which would multiply the incentive and the impact on the ground.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that there needs something needs to happen, but I'm not patient enough to wait for that to happen. So that's why we rather just get started now.
Do either Juan Carlos or Celia want to reply to that? To what they just said, or you don't have to, but just give you an opportunity.
Well, I guess for indigenous communities, and it's about if yes, it's about putting plants in the ground and things like that. But I guess the issues are a lot bigger and broader. And yeah, in New Zealand, our people are doing it. They're doing it now. It is getting the funding to upscale what they're trying to do, and providing avenues for them to create sustainability of income so that they can stay in their communities, so that they don't have to move to the cities, so that their people who were displaced can move home, can reconnect to their land. For me, it's about, in my country, we do have policies. We've been fortunate enough to have a Resource Management Act that does recognise our Indigenous people. Unfortunately, it's coming down to that implementation on the ground and the accountability of the government to make sure that they are actually doing what they're doing, what they said they were going to do. And our people do want to get home. We have the worst rates of poverty, teen suicide, poor housing, living conditions, crime, all those sorts of issues. And so through empowering our Indigenous communities to be able to do their traditional practices, to be able to provide a pathway for them to reconnect back to the land, to find, and through reconnecting back to the land, then they can be able to find their cultural identity again and hold their heads high and live off the land the way they want to. And it's about creating, whether it's social enterprise or whatever, so that they can be sustainable in their own right on their lands, practicing their traditional practices the way they want to.
Okay, well, so I'm just curious, like on the scaling issue. So what you're doing in New Zealand do you see that being applicable beyond New Zealand? Like from what you've learned from what you're doing, could people in other parts of the Pacific or the world leverage that in order to go to scale?
I guess it comes down to governments being open to making sure there are secure policies in place and allowing collaborative processes to happen where Indigenous communities are decision makers, so empowering them to actually be decision makers and that's probably where it needs to take place for other Indigenous communities to get to where we are. It is around the government allowing that to happen and putting strong policies in place to make sure that Indigenous communities have a voice at the table. Yeah.
So we're down to our last minute, so I just want to give the panelists one last chance to say something. So basically, if there was one thing you want to identify as the most critical need or opportunity to move forward from commitment to action, what would that be in like one sentence? So I'll start with Christian.
So before I came here, I talked to somebody who told me about the massive loss of forest that we have in Madagascar at the moment, which I'm sure you know about. And I haven't really seen anything here that makes me believe that next year the situation in Madagascar is going to be better. So I just thought maybe we have to start our own tree planting project there. So then next year we can maybe share some results.
Juan Carlos?
I think just stressing the message I had earlier, I think the action needs to be taken now by linking landscape approaches to the real social problems of the day. And we cannot lose that momentum because policymakers, voters, people, we are competing for a bandwidth of their attention. And the stronger message we can do of the linkages between the land and broader issues, I think the more successful we can be in spreading this message.
And I guess, it's about being inclusive and open to really listen, and I mean really listen to your Indigenous peoples, and when you're working in these communities, and taking a step back to understand why they might be doing things a certain way and understanding their histories, to be able to move forward and just creating those safe spaces for us to really have honest communication.
Nigel?
Collaboration and working together, really coming together to hold each other and the different institutions accountable for the commitments that they're making and what needs to happen. And more selfishly, follow the frog and go out and buy Rainforest Alliance certified tea, coffee, cocoa, bananas, palm oil. It's out there.
And start using Ecosia as your search engine.
Before we thank the panel, can we throw up the slide up one more time, just so people can see it as we thank the panel. So I just want to give them a round of applause. Oh, never mind. So thank you very much.